My name is Olivia Grant, and for most of my 31 years, I believed I had the kind of family people wrote books about. I grew up in a beautiful Victorian house in Charleston, South Carolina, surrounded by love, laughter, and tradition. As the only child of my late father, I was especially close to my grandparents on his side. After my father passed away when I was 22, my grandparents took me in and raised me like their own daughter. Grandpa Edward and Grandma Margaret were my everything. They were wealthy, well-respected, and deeply involved in local charity work. People in our community looked up to them. I worked as an art curator at a local museum, a passion my grandparents had encouraged since I was a little girl. I had a steady relationship with a kind man named Daniel, and I truly believed my future was secure. My grandparents had always promised that I would be taken care of. "You're our legacy, Olivia," Grandpa would say with a warm smile. "Everything we built is for you." The three of us had dinner together every Sunday. We traveled together. We laughed, we cried, we shared secrets. I felt safe. I felt loved. I felt like I belonged. I had no idea that the family I trusted with my entire heart had been hiding a devastating secret for 30 years. A secret that would destroy everything I thought I knew about who I was. After my grandparents passed away within 6 months of each other, the first cracks began to show. The reading of the will was supposed to be straightforward. Grandpa Edward had always told me I was the main beneficiary. But when the lawyer started reading the document, my Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard, my father's siblings, sat with strange, satisfied smiles. The will stated that the majority of the estate, the house, the investments, and most of the money was to be divided between Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard. I was left with only a small trust fund and some sentimental items. I sat there in shock as the lawyer explained that my grandparents had changed the will 2 years earlier. When I asked why, Aunt Patricia put on a sympathetic face and said, "Dad was getting old. Olivia, he got confused about things." Something felt deeply wrong. Grandpa had been sharp as a tack until the very end. He had even updated his medical power of attorney just months before he died, naming me as his primary contact. Then came the strange comments. At the funeral reception, an old family friend pulled me aside and whispered, "Your grandparents always said you were the only real grandchild." I don't understand what happened. I brushed it off as grief and confusion. I told myself that family sometimes got messy with inheritance. I tried to focus on grieving instead of fighting. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. Why would my loving grandparents suddenly cut me out after promising me everything? What were they hiding? The real betrayal came 3 months after the funeral. I had been quietly investigating on my own. I went through old documents and found something shocking, a letter from my grandfather dated just 6 months before he died. In it, he clearly stated that I was to inherit the family home and the majority of the estate. He even referenced a previous will. When I confronted Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard with the letter, their masks finally came off. Aunt Patricia laughed coldly and said, "Olivia, you've always been so naive. That old man was losing his mind. We were protecting the family fortune. Uncle Richard was more direct. You're not even really one of us. Why should you get everything?" Those words hit me like a slap. "What are you talking about?" That's when they dropped the bomb. They claimed my father wasn't my biological father, that my mother had an affair, and I was the result. They said my grandparents only raised me out of obligation, and when they got older, they corrected their mistake by changing the will. I felt the floor disappear beneath me. The family I loved, the grandparents who called me their pride and joy, they had been lying to me for my entire life. The betrayal was complete. Not only had they stolen my inheritance, but they had destroyed my entire identity in one cruel conversation. I left their house in tears, shaking with rage and heartbreak. My perfect family had been alive for 30 years. The weeks after that confrontation were the darkest period of my life. I felt completely lost. Not only had my aunt and uncle stolen my inheritance, but they had also taken away my sense of identity. I didn't know who I was anymore. Every childhood memory, every "you look just like your father" comment now felt like a cruel joke. I stopped going to work. I barely left my apartment. The pain was so deep that some days I couldn't even get out of bed. I would stare at old photos of my grandparents and cry, wondering how people who claimed to love me could do something so heartless. Daniel, the man I was dating, tried to be supportive at first, but eventually he pulled away too. "This is too heavy, Olivia. I didn't sign up for all this family drama." His departure only made me feel more worthless. I started questioning everything: my worth, my place in the world, even whether my grandparents ever truly loved me. The loneliness was crushing. I had lost my family, my home, my financial security, and my sense of self all at once. But even in that deep darkness, a small spark of anger began to grow. A voice inside me whispered that I deserved the truth, and I was going to find it. I was at my lowest when I made a decision that changed everything. I ordered a DNA test. I needed to know if my aunt and uncle were telling the truth about my paternity. The results came back faster than I expected. The test showed something I never saw coming. I was not related to my aunt and uncle at all. But more importantly, I had a close DNA match. A half-sibling, a woman named Sophia, who lived just 2 hours away. When I reached out to her, the truth finally came out. Sophia told me that my biological father was actually my grandfather's best friend, a man named Thomas, who had passed away years ago. My mother had a brief affair during a difficult time in her marriage. When I was born, my grandparents decided to raise me as their own to protect the family name. They told almost no one the truth. My aunt and uncle had always known. They resented me for being the secret child who was favored by their parents. When my grandparents got older, they convinced them to change the will, claiming I wasn't a real Grant. The DNA test exposed the 30-year family secret. I wasn't just being denied my inheritance out of greed. I had been lied to about who I was my entire life. The pain was immense, but for the first time, I also felt free. I finally knew the truth. With the DNA results and the truth in my hands, I was no longer broken, I was determined. I hired a strong estate lawyer and began building a case to contest the will. We gathered evidence, old letters from my grandparents, witness statements from family friends who knew about the secret, and of course the irrefutable DNA test. But I wanted more than just money. I wanted them to feel the weight of their betrayal. My plan was careful and strategic. I didn't rush. I documented everything. I reconnected with Sophia, my half-sister, and we built a beautiful relationship. She became one of my strongest supporters. I also started speaking with a therapist to process the emotional trauma. I needed to be strong and clear-headed for the upcoming legal battle. Every night I would look at the DNA test results and remind myself they tried to erase me. But I'm still here. The revenge wasn't going to be loud screaming matches. It was going to be quiet, legal, and devastating. I was going to take back what was rightfully mine and expose their lies to the entire family. They thought they could steal my inheritance and my identity. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The courtroom was packed on the day of the will contest hearing. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard sat across from me looking smug, confident that their money and connections would protect them. They had no idea what was coming. My lawyer presented our case methodically. First, the original will, then the suspicious timing of the new will, then came the DNA test results. The judge's eyes widened as the evidence was laid out. When my lawyer called Sophia to testify about our biological connection, the courtroom fell silent. Then I took the stand. I looked directly at my aunt and uncle and spoke with a calm, steady voice. You stole my inheritance. You lied to me about who I was for 30 years. You tried to erase me from this family, but the truth always finds its way out. Aunt Patricia's face turned red with anger. Uncle Richard looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. The judge ruled in my favor. He declared the new will invalid due to undue influence and fraud. I was awarded the family home, a significant portion of the estate, and the judge ordered them to pay my legal fees. As we left the courtroom, Aunt Patricia hissed at me, "You're not one of us." I smiled calmly and replied, "You're right. I'm better than you." The 30-year secret was finally exposed, and justice had been served. The months after the court ruling brought a deep sense of peace and renewal. I moved back into my grandparents' beautiful Victorian home, the house I grew up in. It felt like coming full circle. I restored parts of it and turned the garden into a peaceful sanctuary. Sophia, my half-sister, visits often. We've built a wonderful relationship, and she's become one of my closest friends. I returned to my job at the museum with a new appreciation for life. I also started a small foundation in my grandparents' name to help children who discover difficult family truths later in life. Aunt Patricia and Uncle Richard tried to appeal the ruling, but eventually gave up. The family secret is now known throughout our social circle. They keep a very low profile these days. I'm dating again slowly and carefully. This time I choose people based on honesty and kindness, not just charm. Most importantly, I've made peace with my past. I forgave my grandparents for their mistakes. They tried to protect me in their own flawed way. As for my aunt and uncle, I've chosen to let go of the anger. They no longer have power over my happiness. I finally know who I am. The greatest lesson I learned from this painful journey is this: your bloodline doesn't define your worth, your truth does. My aunt and uncle tried to erase me. They stole my inheritance and tried to steal my identity. But in the end, the DNA test didn't just expose their lies, it set me free. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. The family you're born into isn't always the family you're meant to keep. Sometimes the strongest families are the ones you choose, or the ones that choose you. I lost everything I thought I had, but I found something far more valuable myself, and I've never been more at peace.